On the morning of November 9th, 1929, in a windowless side chamber of the Imperial Library of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, an elderly scholar named Halil Edhem was sorting a wooden tray of forgotten Ottoman manuscripts, most of them tax registers and grain warrants from the 17th century, when his cotton-gloved fingers caught on a folded fragment of gazelle skin parchment that did not belong to any of them. He laid it flat on the felt-lined table. It was the surviving western third of a larger map. It was inked in iron gall brown, with hand-colored ochre, vermilion, indigo, and gold leaf. It was signed and dated in a fine Arabic hand, the 9th month of the year 919 after the Hijra, March of 1513 in the Christian reckoning. And along its lower edge, drawn in the same confident curving line as the African and South American coasts, was a coastline that, by every official record of geographical knowledge in 1513, should not have existed. The southern continent of the earth was not officially sighted by any European or Ottoman vessel until January 27, 1820, when the Russian imperial sloops Vostok and Mirny under Captain Fabian von Bellingshausen drifted within sight of an unbroken white shelf at 69 degrees south. The British naval officer Edward Bransfield reported a similar sighting 3 days later. The continent now called Antarctica was, in the strict accounting of European cartography, undiscovered until that month. And yet, here, on a piece of folded gazelle skin 3 centuries older than Bellingshausen, was its coastline. Not as a vague rumor, not as a southern blank labeled Terra Australis Incognita, as a coastline, with bays, with capes, with a recognizable curve of what modern atlases call the Princess Astrid Coast and Queen Maud Land. Halil Edhem did what any careful librarian would do. He folded the parchment back into its protective sleeve, recorded the find in the accession ledger of the Topkapi Saraya Musisi under the catalog number Reven bin 633 Mukerer, and sent a brief letter to the German Orientalist Paul Kalle in Bonn, who replied within the month. Kalle confirmed it. The fragment was the surviving western portion of a world map drawn in 1513 in Gallipoli by an Ottoman naval officer named Hacha Muhiddin Piri ibn Haja Mehmed, a man known to history as Piri Reis. The map had been considered lost for nearly 400 years, and no one, in 1929, knew quite what to do with it. Piri Reis was, in the formal language of the Ottoman court, an admiral of the imperial fleet, a Capudan, who served under 3 sultans and died in 1554 on the executioner's block in Cairo for the loss of a galley fleet at Hormuz. By his own annotations, the 1513 map was not original work. It was a compilation. He drew it, he wrote in the margin, from 20 source maps and 8 Javario and 1 map of the western lands by Colombo, referring to a Christopher Columbus chart he had captured from a Spanish prisoner taken near Valencia. Some of the source maps, he wrote, dated to the time of Iskender Zul Karnain, Alexander the Great. The rest he could not date. He had inherited them, he said, from his uncle Kamal Reis, the corsair admiral, who had collected them from the captured libraries of half the Mediterranean. This admission, recorded in plain Turkish on the surviving parchment, is the first piece of the problem. The official chronology of European exploration in 1513 is exact. Vasco Núñez de Balboa had seen the Pacific from the Isthmus of Panama only 7 months before Piri Reis dated the map. Brazil had been on charts for 13 years. The Caribbean coastline was being revised every shipping season. The map shows all of this, accurately. But the southern coastline, the coastline beneath the Caribbean and beneath the bulge of South America, the coastline that no recorded vessel of 1513 had ever approached, is not vague. It is drawn with the same confident hand as the rest. It is, in places, more accurate than maps drawn 3 centuries later, and it does not appear to be ice. This last detail is the second piece of the problem, and the larger one. The southern coastline on the Piri Reis map is drawn as land, with rivers, with bays, with internal mountain ranges, and an inland feature labeled in Ottoman Turkish as At, the place of the great waters. The Antarctic continent today is not a coastline of bays and rivers. It is an ice cap. The bedrock is buried beneath ice that, in places, is more than 3,000 meters thick. Whatever the parchment was depicting, it was depicting something that, in our recorded geological present, has not been visible for a very long time. For 3 decades after Halil Edhem's discovery, no one published seriously on the question. The map was photographed, transliterated, catalogued, and shelved. The Second World War interrupted further inquiry. Kalle's archive in Bonn was scattered when he fled the Reich in 1939. The map sat. Then, in the late summer of 1959, in a faculty office on the second floor of Parker Hall at Keene State College in southwestern New Hampshire, a 55-year-old history professor named Charles Hutchins Hapgood was reading a recent article on the Peary Rice map when he stopped at the third paragraph and did not turn the page. Hapgood was an unusual academic. He had studied at Harvard under the geophysicist Reginald Aldworth Daly, the man who had, in the 1920s, almost single-handedly forced the geological community to take seriously the possibility of vertical crustal movement on a continental scale. Hapgood had taken his master's degree in history but had never lost the geophysical eye Daly had taught him. He had served in the Office of Strategic Services during the Second World War as a briefing officer for naval cartography, working on chart reconciliation for North Atlantic and Mediterranean operations, and he had retained from that period a habit of treating maps not as illustrations of the world, but as data points about who knew what, when, and from whom. He had already published in 1958 a book called Earth's Shifting Crust, in which he had argued that the Earth's lithosphere had, within geologically recent time, undergone a single rapid displacement of approximately 30 degrees, carrying what is now Antarctica from a position closer to the temperate latitudes into its present polar location. Albert Einstein, who had received the manuscript from Hapgood in 1955, had written a foreword. The foreword was unusually direct. "I frequently receive communications from people," Einstein wrote, "who wish to consult me concerning their unpublished ideas. It goes without saying that these ideas are very seldom possessed of scientific validity. The very first communication, however, that I received from Mr. Hapgood electrified me. His idea is original, of great simplicity, and, if it continues to prove itself, of great importance to everything that is related to the history of the Earth's surface." Einstein died in April 1955. The foreword was published with the book in 1958. His undergraduate seminar in the autumn of 1959 was a course on the history of geography, and the article he was reading reproduced the Peary Rays fragment in grayscale alongside a modern projection of the southern Atlantic. The two southern coastlines, Hapgood realized, did not match. The Peary Rays coastline curved further south, with bays and inlets that the modern projection did not show. He set the article on his desk. He pulled down a 1958 atlas of the Antarctic. He laid the article and the atlas side by side. The Peary Race coastline did not match the modern surface of the Antarctic ice. It matched almost exactly the bedrock of Queen Maud Land and the western Princess Astrid coast, as it had been measured by the Norwegian-British-Swedish Antarctic expedition of 1949, a seismic survey that had only become declassified data in the previous 18 months. The implication, Hapgood understood at once, was either trivial or staggering. Either the match was a coincidence. An Ottoman cartographer in 1513 happened to invent a southern coastline that, by chance, traced the buried rock contour of a continent no living human had ever seen, or it was not a coincidence, and someone in 1513 had access to a map of the Antarctic coastline as it had existed before the ice covered it. Hapgood was a careful man. He did not publish. Instead, that December, he wrote a letter to the United States Air Force. The letter went to the Reconnaissance Technical Squadron at Westover Air Force Base in Chicopee, Massachusetts, the unit responsible at the time for cartographic verification of polar imagery for the Strategic Air Command. Hapgood enclosed a tracing of the southern coastline of the Peary Rise map, a 1949 seismic profile chart of Queen Maud Land, released by the NBSX expedition, and 3 short paragraphs describing the match he believed he had found. He asked one question. He asked the United States Air Force whether the coastline on the Ottoman parchment was, or was not, an accurate depiction of Antarctic bedrock under the ice. On July 6, 1960, the commander of the 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron, a lieutenant colonel named Harold Zoe Ohlmeyer, replied. The reply was a single page on Westover Air Force Base, letterhead. It is in the public archive. The third paragraph reads, and these are the exact words of an officer of the United States Strategic Air Command, writing in his official capacity in 1960. The geographical detail shown in the lower part of the map agrees very remarkably with the results of the seismic profile made across the top of the ice cap by the Swedish-British Antarctic expedition of 1949. This indicates the coastline had been mapped before it was covered by the ice cap. The ice cap in this region is now about a mile thick. We have no idea how the data on this map can be reconciled with the supposed state of geographical knowledge in 1513. The letter was signed, dated, and stamped. It was filed in the squadron records and forwarded to Hapgood. He kept the original in a manila folder in his desk at Keene State for the rest of his life. If you have stayed with this account so far, this is a useful moment to subscribe to the sealed archive, because the rest of what follows did not stay buried, and we are still recovering it. Hapgood and his students spent the next 5 years working through every world map they could photograph from the world's libraries. They were not looking for the Piri Reis map. They were looking for any other 1513 or earlier map that contained a coastline it could not have known. They found 4. The first was a map by the French royal cartographer Oronteus Phineus, published in Paris in 1531, 18 years after Piri Reis. The Phineus world map shows a southern continent, labeled Terra Australis Recenter Inventa, recently discovered. The continent has rivers running from the interior to the coast. It has named mountain ranges. It has the recognizable shape of Antarctica. Its coastline, when superimposed on a modern projection, matches the bedrock of the East Antarctic Shield with errors of less than 200 nautical miles. The second was the world map of Gerardus Mercator, published in Duisburg in 1569, the foundational atlas of European cartography, the work that gave the world the projection still used in every classroom. Mercator was a Flemish Lutheran mathematician, working under the protection of the Duke of Cleves after fleeing the Inquisition. His 1569 chart was an act of consolidation. He had access, through a network of correspondence that included the Spanish royal cartographers, to nearly every major map circulating in mid-16th century Europe. His southern continent is not labeled speculative. It is drawn with the same line weight as Africa. It contains internal features, a long, west-trending mountain range running parallel to the southern coast at approximately 75 degrees south, a great river issuing from an inland watershed at roughly the longitude of the modern South Pole, and a peninsular outcropping at roughly 73 degrees south latitude, every one of which corresponds on the Norwegian, British, Swedish seismic chart to a feature of the bedrock under what is now the Filchner Ron ice shelf. Mercator named the long range, in his Latin, the Mons Maximus. The IGY surveys, 400 years later, confirmed a buried mountain chain at the same latitude. They named it the Gambortsef Mountains. The two ranges are the same range. The third was a world chart by Philippe Boitch, the chief cartographer of the French Royal Academy of Sciences, presented to the Académie in 1737. Boitch's southern continent is drawn as 2 separate landmasses divided by an inland sea, with a narrow strait running roughly along the line that would now be called the Transantarctic Mountains. This was, in 1737, considered eccentric speculation, a Bourbon court oddity, and the chart was reproduced for several decades only as a curiosity. It is also, as the IGY seismic surveys would later confirm, the actual sub-glacial structure of Antarctica, a smaller West Antarctic island connected to a larger East Antarctic plate by a buried continental shelf currently filled with ice. Without the ice, Antarctica is 2 landmasses. Boitch, who had no instrument capable of seeing through ice, drew it that way 220 years before anyone else could verify the structure. The fourth was a Portolan-style chart by the Turkish admiral Haji Ahmed, signed in Venice in 1559, depicting a glacier-free southern continent with a coastline that traced the modern bedrock contour with errors of less than 3% across more than 2,000 miles. The Haji Ahmed map carried, in its lower margin, an inscription stating that it was compiled from very ancient charts in the language of the Ionians, meaning, in mid-16th century Ottoman scholarship, source documents older than the Library of Alexandria, 4 maps, 4 cartographers, 3 centuries between the earliest and the latest, none of them connected by geography or politics. Piri Reis was an Ottoman admiral working in Gallipoli. Phineus was a French royal mathematician working in Paris. Mercator was a Flemish Lutheran working in Duisburg under the Duke of Cleves. Boitier was a Bourbon court geographer working at the French Royal Academy of Sciences in the Rue Saint-Jacques. Each of them, on his own admission, working from older source maps that he had not himself drawn and did not always understand. Each of them, on the parchment he produced, including a coastline that the official scientific record of his own century said could not exist. And each of them, when superimposed in 1959 onto the seismic profile of a continent that no living human had ever seen the rock of, matching that profile within margins that no random invention could produce. Hapgood collected this evidence into a manuscript he called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, Evidence of Advanced Civilization in the Ice Age. He published it in 1966 with Chilton Books in Philadelphia. He had asked the year before whether one further reader would consent to write a foreword. The reader was Albert Einstein. Einstein had already, in 1958, written a foreword to Hapgood's earlier book, Earth's Shifting Crust, in which he had called Hapgood's hypothesis of great importance to everything that is related to the history of the Earth's surface. Einstein died in 1955, before Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings could carry his foreword. The Hapgood manuscript carried a dedication to him instead. By the time the book reached print, the International Geophysical Year, the 18-month coordinated global scientific effort that ran from July 1957 to December 1958, had completed the first comprehensive seismic mapping of Antarctica. 67 nations, 4,000 stations, the first ice-penetrating radar surveys, the first measurements that could see through the ice and read the rock beneath. The technique was straightforward and the cost extraordinary. Survey teams of 4 to 12 men, dragged by tracked weasel vehicles or hauled by dog sled, would lay a line of geophones across the ice surface for distances of 100 meters to a kilometer. They would set off a calibrated charge, a small explosive detonation, or in some surveys, a vibrator plate, at one end of the line. The shock wave would travel down through the ice, reflect off the bedrock, and return. The time delay, recorded on a paper tape seismograph turning under the hand of a bundled-up surveyor, gave the depth to the rock at that point. They moved the line. They fired again. They moved the line. They fired again. They did this for 2.5 years across the entire Antarctic continent, in temperatures that froze grease in the gun cases and shattered the glass on the recorders. The data was tabulated in pencil and field notebooks, transcribed onto paper tape graphs, mailed to compilation centers in Cambridge and Washington and Oslo, and published in stages between 1959 and 1962. The final compiled bedrock contour appearing in the 1964 Atlas of the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research. The bedrock contour matched the Piri Reis coastline. It matched the Phineas continent. It matched Mercator's interior mountain range. It matched with quiet exactness Boitier's two-island structure. In other words, every cartographer between 1513 and 1737 who had drawn an Antarctic continent that the science of his own century could not justify had drawn a continent that the science of 1958 confirmed. Before the IGY data was released, the world had only surface maps of Antarctica, maps of the ice, maps of what the eye could see. The last full year of that surface-only record was 1956. The 1957 to 58 expeditions mapped what was underneath. They mapped the rock. And the rock, according to a 1513 piece of gazelle skin parchment in a folder in the Topkapi Palace Museum, had already been mapped by someone before the ice arrived. This is the framing that the sealed archive holds in its working catalog under the slug, Antarctic 1956. The coastlines of Antarctica did not refreeze in our records until 1956, because before 1957, our records did not see the rock. The Piri Reis cartographer was not seeing through the ice with imaginary instruments. He was, on every available indication, copying from a source map that had been drawn at a time when the rock he was copying was not yet under ice. The geological community has not, as of this filming, formally accepted this conclusion. The standard cartographic history textbooks continue to attribute the southern coastlines of Piri Reis, Phineas, Mercator, and Boitier to speculation and decorative projection. The standard journals do not engage with Hapgood's hypothesis except in dismissive footnotes. There are reasons for this. Hapgood's secondary thesis, that the source maps were the surviving fragments of a pre-Ice Age civilization that mapped the coastline before the last glacial maximum, is a thesis that no peer-reviewed institution can adopt without consequences far larger than cartography. It is easier, in the institutional logic of the late 20th century, to leave the Ohlmeyer letter unindexed and the Topkapi parchment unannotated. Halil Edhem, who found the parchment, died in 1938 without publishing on the southern coastline. Paul Kala, who confirmed it, fled Nazi Germany in 1939, and his archive was scattered between Bonn, Birmingham, and Dusseldorf, the bulk of it never reassembled. Charles Hapgood lived until December 21st, 1982, when he was struck by a vehicle in a hit-and-run accident on a street in Greenfield, Massachusetts, returning home from a visit to a colleague. He was 78 years old. The driver was never identified. The vehicle was never recovered. The manila folder containing the original Ohlmeyer letter, his correspondence with Albert Einstein, and his unpublished further work on the Mercator, Boache, and Haji Ahmed charts was reported missing from his office at his home address between the date of his death and the inventory of his estate 3 weeks later. A handwritten card on his desk, dated 5 days before the accident and addressed to his publisher, contained a single sentence. "I think the source maps are older than we have allowed ourselves to think." Lieutenant Colonel Harold Z. Ohlmeyer continued to serve in Strategic Air Command until 1972 and never publicly retracted, modified, or qualified the contents of his July 6, 1960 letter. The letter is on file. Anyone with the catalog reference can read it. The Piri Reis fragment is now in a climate-controlled glass case in the Topkapi Musea in Istanbul. The case is lit with low museum-grade tungsten. Visitors stand at a brass rail and look down through the glass. The label beside the case reads, in 3 languages, World Map, Piri Reis, 1513. It does not mention the southern coastline. It does not mention Lieutenant Colonel Ohlmeyer. It does not mention 1956. The map is still there. The coastline is still drawn. The ice over the same coastline is still about a mile thick. And somewhere in the working files of the United States 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron, in a manila folder cross-referenced to a 1949 Norwegian-British-Swedish seismic profile, is a single page of typed Westover Air Force Base letterhead that has never been formally retracted, in which an officer of the Strategic Air Command stated, in writing, that the data on the 1513 map could not be reconciled with the supposed state of geographical knowledge of 1513. The sealed archive does not assert what the source maps were. It does not assert who drew them. It asserts only what the parchment shows, what the seismic survey confirmed, and what the letter said. The rest is for the listener. The coastlines of Antarctica did not refreeze in our records until 1956. They were drawn, in iron gall ink on gazelle skin, in the spring of 1513. And somewhere, in a source map that Piri Reis copied and did not understand, they were drawn earlier still. If this story has stayed with you, the channel keeps a working catalog of the documents we have been able to recover and verify. Subscribe to follow the next entry. The archive is open. The records are still there. They have only been left unread.